Zyair Van Der Holt, Callista Van Der Holt, and Seraphina Lockwood, three names that would soon be etched into the annals of scandal, betrayal, and murder. What began as a picture-perfect marriage at the pinnacle of wealth and power unraveled into a chilling tale of deception. A billionaire husband who abandoned his pregnant wife in her most vulnerable moment. A mistress who played a dangerous game of manipulation, and a single, irreversible act of violence that would destroy them all. This is the true crime story that shocked the world. A tale of love turned lethal, ambition turned obsession, and a man who had it all only to lose everything. Zyair Van Der Holt was a name that commanded attention. The billionaire entrepreneur had built his empire from the ground up, a sprawling conglomerate that spanned finance, technology, and luxury real estate. He was admired, envied, and feared in equal measure. To the outside world, he had it all: wealth, influence, and a wife who seemed to embody grace and devotion. Callista Van Der Holt, once a respected journalist, had given up her career to stand beside him. Their marriage was the subject of glossy magazine spreads and social media admiration, the perfect union of ambition and elegance. The announcement of Callista's pregnancy had been a moment of celebration. The press covered the news as if royalty were expecting an heir, and Zyair basked in the public adoration. His carefully crafted image as a loving husband and soon-to-be father only solidified his standing as one of the most powerful men in the country. But beneath the polished exterior, cracks had begun to form. Those closest to the Van Der Holts whispered about Zyair's frequent absences, his business trips that stretched longer than necessary, and the late-night calls he always stepped away to take. Callista, ever the poised and composed wife, ignored the growing suspicions. She had made peace with the fact that her husband's devotion to his empire often overshadowed his attention to their marriage. But even she could not deny the unsettling feeling that she was no longer his priority. As her due date approached, she tried to focus on the excitement of welcoming their child into the world. She filled the nursery with soft pastels, carefully, selecting each piece of furniture and decoration. She attended doctor's appointments alone more often than not, brushing off concerns when friends asked why Zyair was absent. He was busy, she would say. His work was demanding. He cared, even if he didn't always show it. On the night that changed everything, Callista was alone in their mansion. Zyair had left earlier that morning for what he had claimed was an urgent business meeting. He had promised to return by evening, but as the hours ticked by, he remained unreachable. When the contractions began, sharp and unrelenting, panic settled in. She called him repeatedly, each unanswered call increasing her sense of dread. The house, normally a sanctuary of luxury, felt unbearably empty. Struggling through the pain, she reached out to her personal assistant, who arrived within minutes and rushed her to the hospital. The staff at the hospital recognized her immediately, offering reassurance as they wheeled her into the maternity ward. But Callista's mind was elsewhere. She could not shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong, not with her pregnancy, but with Zyair's absence. Meanwhile, across the city, Zyair was indeed at a hospital, but not for his wife. He sat in a private suite at an exclusive medical facility, his presence concealed from the public. At his side was Seraphina Lockwood, the woman he had been secretly seeing for over a year. She, too, was in labor. Unlike Callista, Seraphina had Zyair's full attention. He had ensured she was admitted to the most elite hospital money could buy, with a team of top specialists at her disposal. No expense had been spared for her comfort. As she clutched his hand, breathing through her contractions, Zyair remained, composed, oblivious to the betrayal unfolding in real time. His phone vibrated on the table beside him, Callista's name flashing across the screen. He ignored it, brushing it aside as another one of her overreactions. She would be fine, he told himself, She always was, but this time he was wrong. Callista's body trembled as another contraction ripped through her. The pain was unbearable, but the fear was worse. Her hands clutched the sides of the hospital bed, knuckles white from the pressure. The doctors moved quickly, voices calm, but urgent as they prepared for her delivery. Yet no matter how many nurses reassured her, the one person she needed most was still nowhere to be found. Zyair had yet to return her calls, had yet to show up at the hospital, and the sinking realization that she was going to bring their child into the world alone made the agony even more excruciating. Her assistant, the only person by her side, sent message after message, reaching out to anyone who might know where he was. The responses were the same. No one had seen him, no one had heard from him, and no one had any answers. The man who prided himself on control, who made sure his name was spoken with reverence in every corner of the city, had vanished at the moment his family needed him the most. As Callista fought through the contractions across the city, Zyair was pacing inside a private hospital suite, unaware of the turmoil he had left behind. His focus remained on Seraphina, who lay in a hospital bed far removed from the chaos of a public maternity ward. Her pregnancy, unlike Callista's, had been shielded from the world. There were no media announcements, no grand celebrations, just secrecy and whispered conversations behind closed doors. Seraphina's delivery had been carefully planned with only the best specialists attending to her. She had grown accustomed to the luxuries Zyair provided, and tonight was no different. As she winced in pain, he pressed a cool towel against her forehead, whispering empty reassurances. He was hers, at least in this moment. She had ensured that. The truth was, Seraphina had known about Callista's pregnancy from the start. She had listened to his dismissive comments about his wife, about how he was staying for the sake of appearances, about how their marriage had lost its meaning long ago. She had played the role of the perfect escape, offering him something he claimed Callista never could, passion without responsibility. But now, with her child almost here, she needed more than whispered promises. She needed security, and she needed to ensure that she and her baby had a future in Zyair's world. Back at the public hospital, Callista's condition had taken a turn for the worse. Her blood pressure had skyrocketed, and the doctors were now concerned about potential complications. The stress of the situation, combined with the physical toll of labor, had placed both her life and the baby's at risk. The nurses continued to check their equipment, their faces tense as they prepared for a potential emergency, but no one was more terrified than Callista herself. Her vision blurred as exhaustion set in. She tried to focus, tried to stay strong, but the overwhelming sense of abandonment consumed her. The man she had trusted, the father of her child, had chosen to be somewhere else. It wasn't a simple absence, it was a deliberate decision. And with every unanswered call, every second that passed without him by her side, the truth became undeniable. Zyair had made his choice, and it wasn't her. At that same moment, Seraphina's cries of pain filled the luxurious hospital room. Her baby was coming. Zyair remained at her side, his hands gripping hers tightly as she fought through the final moments of labor. The doctors moved efficiently, delivering a healthy baby boy into the world. The room erupted in quiet celebrations as the newborn's first cries echoed through the air. Seraphina sobbed with relief, and Zyair exhaled, emotion flickering across his usually composed face. But his relief was short-lived. Just as he reached for his phone to call his assistant, an urgent notification flashed across the screen. A message from Callista's doctor. She was in critical condition. Panic surged through him, but it was too late. The damage had already been done. Elias Cormac had been watching Zyair Van Der Holt for months, long before the billionaire even suspected he was being followed. Hired by one of Zyair's business rivals, Elias's original task had been to uncover financial discrepancies. evidence of tax fraud, embezzlement, or anything that could be used against him. But what had started as a corporate investigation had quickly unraveled into something far more sinister. The trail of secrets led him to Seraphina Lockwood, a woman whose name had never appeared in any official documents linked to Zyair. Yet, she had been given a luxury penthouse, an unlimited credit card, and frequent visits from the billionaire himself. When Elias began tailing her, the truth became clear. She was pregnant, and Zyair was deeply invested in keeping her comfortable. This alone would have been a scandal big enough to ruin his marriage, but what Elias discovered next changed everything. Through careful surveillance and strategic informants, Elias had managed to get his hands on medical records. The tests performed at the private hospital where Seraphina was admitted had revealed something shocking. Zyair was not the father of her child. The DNA analysis proved it beyond a doubt. Yet Seraphina had never corrected his assumption, never confessed the truth. She had been playing a dangerous game, and Zyair had fallen for it completely. At the time Seraphina gave birth, Elias had been waiting outside the hospital, watching the billionaire through the glass doors. He observed Zyair's proud expression as he held the newborn, his complete ignorance of the deception unfolding around him. Seraphina, exhausted but triumphant, had secured her place in his life, or so she thought. Elias had not planned to reveal his findings immediately, but the events that followed forced his hand. Callista Van Der Holt had been rushed into emergency surgery. The news hit the media within hours, and the internet erupted with speculation. Where was Zyair? Why had he abandoned his wife at such a critical moment? The press, who once praised him as a devoted husband, now turned against him, dissecting every piece of his public image. Elias knew it was time. He compiled the evidence, videos, photographs, medical reports, and sent them anonymously to several major news outlets. Within hours, headlines emerged, exposing not only Zyair's affair, but the even more humiliating truth that he had been deceived. The man who controlled millions, who was known for outsmarting competitors and bending markets to his will, had been manipulated by his own mistress. Zyair had barely left Seraphina's hospital room when the first phone call came in. His public relations team was frantic, trying to contain the fallout, but the damage was already done. When he saw the news, his entire world collapsed. The affair was out. The birth of Seraphina's child was out. But the most devastating part was that now everyone knew he wasn't even the father. Fury consumed him. He turned to Seraphina, demanding an explanation, but she simply looked at him, silent and unbothered. She had never promised him anything. He had assumed, and she had let him. Now, with her newborn in her arms, she didn't need him anymore. As the media continued to tear apart his reputation, Zyair's thoughts drifted to Callista. She had almost died while he had been here, playing house with a woman who had betrayed him. Guilt clawed at his chest, but when he picked up his phone to call the hospital, it was too late. Callista had already made her decision. She wanted nothing to do with him. The woman he had discarded had survived without him. The woman he had chosen had never needed him. And the life he had built so carefully was now crumbling beyond repair. Zyair Van Der Holt had always been in control. He controlled markets, people, and outcomes, bending the world to his will. But as he stared at the news reports flashing across every major network, control had slipped through his fingers. His affair had been exposed, his reputation shredded, and the biggest humiliation of all, he had been raising another man's child in his mind without even realizing it. The hospital room felt suffocating. Seraphina cradled her newborn, seemingly unaffected by the chaos that had erupted outside. She barely acknowledged Zyair's presence as he stood there, fists clenched, jaw tight. The betrayal burned hotter than anything he had ever experienced. He had left his wife, his pregnant wife, in a moment of crisis for this woman. He had given her everything: protected her, ensured her every need was met, only to be made a fool. His phone buzzed endlessly with calls from lawyers, advisors, and business partners desperate for damage control. Stock in his companies had taken a hit. Investors were withdrawing support. Even his closest allies were distancing themselves. The scandal was bigger than just an affair. It was a story of arrogance, manipulation, and deception on a scale that fascinated the public. The Van Der Holt empire was now tainted, its perfect image shattered. Zyair turned to Seraphina, his voice low and dangerous. He demanded answers, but she remained maddeningly calm. There was no apology, no explanation, just an infuriating silence. She knew exactly what she had done, and she didn't care. He had played his game, and she had played hers. The difference was, she had won. Anger surged through him like wildfire. His mind raced with every sacrifice he had made for her, every moment he had risked his legacy, his marriage, and his reputation. He had placed her above everything. And for what? For a child that wasn't his? For a woman who had never loved him? The walls of his carefully constructed world were closing in, and he was suffocating under the weight of his own mistakes. The argument between them escalated. Seraphina finally spoke, her voice cold and emotionless. She told him that she had never asked him to leave his wife, never asked him to assume responsibility for her child. She had merely allowed him to believe what he wanted. He had made his choices, and now he had to live with them. Zyair snapped. The realization that he had destroyed his life for a lie was too much to bear. His vision blurred with rage as he stepped forward. The details of what happened next would later be debated in courtrooms and news segments across the country. But one fact remained undisputed. When the nurses entered the room, Seraphina was lifeless. The woman who had once held so much power over him now lay motionless, her breath stolen in a final act of violence. Panic set in almost immediately. Zyair, the man who had always been untouchable, was now a murderer. He tried to cover his tracks, erasing evidence, fabricating a story, but it was futile. The hospital had security cameras, medical staff had heard raised voices, and forensic evidence would soon confirm what had taken place. The moment he had acted on his rage, he had sealed his fate. As he stepped out of the hospital, his designer suit stained with chaos, flashing red and blue lights surrounded him. Police officers moved in, their orders sharp and unforgiving. He didn't resist. There was no point. He had spent his life believing he was above consequence. But now, there was nowhere left to run. Zyair Van Der Holt, the billionaire who once had everything, was escorted into the back of a police car, his downfall complete. The man who had abandoned his wife, who had chased after another life, was now left with nothing but the weight of his choices. And for the first time in his life, he had lost control completely. The trial of Zyair Van Der Holt became one of the most sensational legal battles in modern history. News networks ran endless coverage, dissecting every detail of his affair, his betrayal, and ultimately his crime. Legal analysts debated whether it had been a crime of passion or a calculated act of rage. The prosecution painted him as a man who thought he was untouchable, who had lived so long without consequence that he believed even murder could be swept under the rug. The defense, desperate to salvage what they could, argued that he had been emotionally manipulated, driven to a breaking point by Seraphina's deception, but none of it mattered. The evidence was overwhelming. Security footage captured the moment of the attack. Witnesses testified to the raised voices, the escalating tension, the final, fatal outcome. The DNA test confirming that the baby wasn't his only added to the prosecution's argument. Zyair had snapped the moment he realized he had been deceived. The jury deliberated for less than a day before delivering their verdict: guilty. As the judge read out his sentence, 25 years without the possibility of parole, Zyair remained silent. He had spent his entire life believing that power could buy him anything. Now, stripped of his wealth, his influence, and his freedom, he had nothing left to bargain with. Callista had not attended the trial. She had followed the case from a distance, focusing instead on her recovery and her newborn son. She had survived the ordeal that nearly took her life, but she was no longer the woman she had been before. The perfect, polished wife of Zyair Van Der Holt was gone. In her place was someone stronger, someone who had learned the hard way that love built on illusions was never truly love at all. In the weeks following the trial, she finalized the divorce, cutting all legal ties to the man who had once controlled every aspect of her life. His assets were seized, his businesses fell into turmoil, and his once loyal allies turned their backs on him. The empire he had built crumbled without him at the helm. Callista, however, thrived. In the wake of the scandal, publishers reached out with book deals, media outlets offered exclusive interviews, and women across the country rallied around her as a symbol of resilience. But she wanted none of it. She declined every offer, choosing instead to focus on her son and the quiet, private life she had always longed for. As Zyair adjusted to his new reality behind bars, Callista took her first steps toward a future she had never imagined. The mansion that had once felt like a gilded cage was sold. She moved into a smaller, more modest home, one without staff and without the constant reminder of the life she had left behind. She found solace in the simplest moments, watching her son sleep, feeling the warmth of the sun on her skin, knowing that for the first time in years, she was free. Across the city, the world moved on without Zyair Van Der Holt. The companies he had built were taken over by new leadership. His name faded from the headlines, replaced by the next scandal, the next billionaire downfall. Seraphina's child was placed in the care of her family, shielded from the legacy of betrayal and destruction left behind. And somewhere in the silence of his prison cell, Zyair finally understood the full weight of what he had lost. Not just his fortune or his freedom, but the one person who had ever truly stood by his side. But it was too late. It had always been too late.